What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Behind the Facade. I'm your host, Gavin J. Gallagher, and on this podcast, I explore the mental and emotional game often playing out subconsciously both in your mind and the mind of everyone else in the real estate or property investment market. The key to success in this game is to master your mindset and behavior, to take control of your thoughts, your emotions, and, most importantly, your ego. Welcome to the show. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode. And this week I have an interesting conversation with a return guest. And this guest came on to the podcast way back at the very beginning of this show. And it was episode 19 when I invited David Jelly of Property Bridges to come on and talk about his, which was at the time a new peer-to-peer lending platform. Now, 3.5 years or thereabouts has passed, and now we are talking to David Jelly again today. But rather than it being a bit of a startup, we now have a conversation with somebody who has 7,000 lenders on his platform and has loaned out over 40 million to Irish house builders and property investors. So I think it's going to be a very relevant conversation. And before I introduce David, I just want to announce a very exciting collaboration I'm doing with David. And what we're going to have is my usual mastermind in-person event, which is exclusively for mastermind members. I'm actually going to open it up for the first Saturday of February is the 3rd of February. And we're going to do a funding workshop with David on how to get funded through Property Bridges. And so I think this will be a valuable day to come along as a non-member of the mastermind. I don't do this typically, but it's just that I do think that this is a valuable thing, and there will be people listening in that may find a great deal of value in this. So I'm going to put a link down below if you would like to book a place. There's only going to be 20 of them being given away. I have to keep space for my members, my existing members, and so they get first priority. But I'm going to make 20 spaces available to anyone out there who's listening who would be interested in attending. It's not free. I have to charge because the mastermind members have paid for their place there, and so that's one of the reasons why we're doing this. But I do think anyone who's getting into house building or property investment, development, refurb, anything like that, this will be a great masterclass from David on how to get funding through his platform, Property Bridges. So without further ado, let's get into a conversation on how to go about all of that with David Jelly of Property Bridges. David Jelly, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Gavin. Thanks for having me.
David, this is the second time you have been on the podcast, and we were just chatting there before we hit record, and it does seem that you were on episode 19 and we're now at episode 190 something. So it's way back in like August or something in 2020. And so that's like plus 3 years. So it's been quite a time frame since we chatted last. And I kind of thought, you and I, we talked about your business, Property Bridges. We talked about, the formation of it, and we talked about, your journey to, setting up the business and all that. Today, I think what's going to be really helpful for the audience is going to be getting into how they might use Property Bridges as some sort of a financing vehicle in order to help them pull projects together in the Irish property market. And but why don't we kick off with that? Why don't you just give like a description of your business and the kind of clients you're looking for and what kind of size projects you finance?
Yeah. Thanks again, Gavin, and congratulations on your podcast and how far you've got. August 2020, I think we're in just trying to get to grips with COVID when we last spoke. So I'm not sure how much your lenders know about Property Bridges, so I'll give a quick overview of Property Bridges, and then we can maybe get into a potential borrower and what sort of information we would need from a borrower to get funding. So Property Bridges is a peer-to-peer lender in the Irish market. So we would fund small to medium-sized property developers, so property investors, property developers. We would provide bridging and development finance to those. So we have an online platform that's now fully regulated with the Central Bank of Ireland, and we have 7,000 lenders. So most of those lenders are Irish-based lenders, and that can invest in our platform anywhere from €500 to €100,000 per tranche. They come from all walks of life, but we're really trying to connect domestic funding sources in Ireland to local projects and local SME home builders, quality home builders with a good track record. Because essentially there's still a funding gap in the market. Banks still aren't comfortable lending to SME property developers and home builders.
It's a good description, David. And like you mentioned, property investors and property developers and home builders and stuff. Like, how would you say this? What's the split of the projects that you fund typically? Like, is it somebody like, like ourselves that would buy a site and build, in this case, we're doing this podcast from my new home, and this is a scheme of 54 units. Would that be that would probably be a bit on the large side, or would that be a normal size for you guys?
Yeah, 54 units is certainly in the large size for peer-to-peer, the peer-to-peer platform. Now
Yeah.
we do have a credit line with a Swedish bank. So the way Property Bridges would operate is anything from 500,000 to 3 million. We would look to fund that on the peer-to-peer platform, and anything from 3 million to 10 million, we would look to fund that with our partners, RS Capital.
Swedish bank. Right. Okay, I get you.
Yeah.
And in terms of the different projects, development is obviously it's quite a specialized area because you're getting into, building something from scratch. What kind of investors would you be dealing with? Would it be people doing, B or where you're kind of refurbishing, renovating a house, or are you looking at larger schemes, or what are you looking at kind of?
Well, we get all types of proposals at Property Bridges. Like the last 5 years, we've seen an awful lot. I guess our typical deal that would be kind of really fit into what we'd like to see is it's a development between 5 and 15 units of new build homes.
Okay, new build.
So exactly what you said, the developer would either purchase a site or come to us for some site finance, and then would require us to provide the WIP, the development finance until completion. But we have we've provided refurb finance. So
Okay.
we provided finance for a project just off on Bachelor's Walk, just beside O'Connell Bridge,
Yeah.
where the property investor would have bought the property, would have got planning in the property to convert it to apartments, and then would have converted the property to apartments, and then refinanced us on the other end.
Right, I get you.
Um,
So they
so
bring in then a pillar bank, one of the bigger banks to kind of replace your funding, but they never would have touched the project at the beginning.
no, the banks would never touch the project because it's I mean it needs refurb before
Yeah,
it's
before the banks will consider. It needs income stabilization, basically, doesn't
correct.
it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And
So
quite
you get
often, quite often for those projects, yeah, if the developer has a relationship with a bank, they can get it refinanced with the bank. But there's also, other alternative lenders in that space. So I'm sure you're familiar with Finance Ireland, Capital Flow, and there's a few others in that space that also provide that type of finance.
yeah, yeah. And tell me, I mean, in terms of the typical deal structure, is it pretty much alongside what you would see in the normal banks? Is it like, senior debt kind of type of thing, or is your arrangement any different?
We're very similar to what a bank would provide. Um, Although the LTVs and LTCs might be different, and I think as well the banks just aren't interested in operating in the volumes that we operate in. So sub 3 million, I'm not sure if the banks really have an appetite. The banks, I don't want to speak out of turn, but typically the reason why someone would go to an alternative lender as opposed to the banks would be they might need they might need additional funding or further leverage. So alternative lenders typically would go to higher LTV and LTC than the banks.
I get you. Right.
And
Okay.
so if you don't have a incredibly strong record, and if you don't have a large amount of equity, you might find yourself in a position where the banks just don't have an appetite for it, and then you'll be coming to someone like yourselves.
Interesting. Yeah. And I mean, I just actually, I was just thinking as you were saying a couple of those terms, there may be people listening to the podcast who aren't familiar with the terminology that you're using. So LTV, loan to value, LTC,
Loan to cost.
loan
Loan
to
to
cost,
cost.
and WIP is obviously work in progress.
Yeah,
Yeah.
correct.
I just want that just in case people are kind of wondering, oh, what's he talking about? And so in terms of the steps, like how when somebody is thinking, like somebody will see a project, will say there's an opportunity and they see it and they kind of go, oh, geez, I'd love to do that. What kind of time frame can you turn the thing around in? Because sometimes people are, looking at a project that they have to buy, secure. Obviously, they've got to kind of get, their funding in place before they can go ahead. How fast can you turn it around typically?
So from term sheet to drawdown, you're looking at between 4 to 6 weeks.
Right.
And the length of that process is going to come down to the flow of information between both sides and the speed of the solicitors on both sides. So whenever a term sheet is accepted from us, we would then switch into due diligence mode. So we would instruct our valuation partners, would instruct our quantity surveyors, and would instruct our solicitors.
Right.
And then from that stage onwards, there's a huge amount of back and forth between all parties. And then when everything's in place, and the security's in place, then we can draw down at that stage. But the due diligence process is robust, and it's there
It
are
has to be, of
it
course.
has to be robust.
You're peer-to-peer lend your
Yeah,
partners there that are kind of waiting in the wings. They're not going to be too happy if you haven't done your homework and the project falls over. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So it's a set process. It usually takes between 4 to 6 weeks. And depending on the project, there's a number of parties involved. If it's a bridging loan and there's no development, there might not be a need for a QS. But certainly for all our loans, we need valuation and the legal work.
And tell me this, I mean, I'm just thinking about deals that I've done in the last couple of years with them. When it comes to development, sometimes you'll be buying a site and, 4 to 6 weeks, there's no way you'll have planning in that time period. So
Mm.
how do you typically go about place? Do you base it on any assumptions or is it all based on the actual value? And then if there's an uplift after planning, that's a different deal.
Yeah, a lot of lenders won't lend if there's no planning in place.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to get funding if there's no planning in place. We have lent on occasion on a couple of sites that where the intention is to get planning.
Right.
But typically, if we lend on that, it could be a property that the developer is purchasing that they're looking to demolish and build maybe four houses when they get planning, for example. So on that particular example, we could only land on what the current value of
Value.
the property is. So we're not taking into consideration any uplift value because the way the planning process is at the minute,
Yeah. Could take forever. Yeah.
it's just too risky.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, I was just thinking about, in terms of the different hurdles that I've seen myself, and you're kind of thinking like you have to bring in, sometimes you'll have to bring in a partner to help you acquire the site. Um, and then, the planning process that you have to go through, appointing the architect and whatever in order to get you to that point. And maybe that's the way if people are short of the funding, but then at least the work in progress funding for the construction and whatever, that's where you guys could come in.
Yeah, and at that stage of the process, I would definitely recommend an equity partner. as opposed to debt. Because if you're taking a high level debt at that point in the process, um, that debt counter is always clicking. So if the planning is delayed for whatever reason,
It can be very
the
expensive.
debt's going to continue to accrue. Whereas if you have an equity partner in there with you, and they're going to get like part of the uplift, if the planning's delayed for whatever reason, they can live with that a little bit better. So at that stage, with a risk involved, it's definitely better to get an equity partner if you can source one.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think there's people out there with an appetite for it. It's just really, does the person who wants to do the deal with you, do they have, a reputation? Have they been around long enough that people are not worried about this person? Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah,
I've seen that before where, there's people that they're a little bit green and they don't really know what they're doing and they're, out there kind of looking for partners and stuff. And that's, potentially problematic. You really do need to know what you're doing if you're getting into the development side of things.
yeah, absolutely. Like a lot of people that come to us would have a track record, or they would be in a trade, where they would have an extensive experience in a trade, and they're starting off on their own to do a refurb and then potentially getting into new builds. But there's so much regulation in the space now, and rightly so, that it's very difficult for a novice to get in, and in particular into new builds. Like refurb still takes a lot of knowledge, and there can be a lot of whenever you if you're trying to get into the space and you see a building that you think you can do a refurb job on, and flip it at the end. um there could be a lot of problems in existing buildings, as you well know.
Yeah.
At least with new builds, as a funder, if there's a green field and we have a trusted borrower, there's flood conditions. The risk is sometimes quantifiable, but when you're getting into an old building, sometimes you don't know what you're going to find. Quite often, it can be riskier.
Yeah. I've had very unusual situations with old buildings where you take down a piece of plasterboard and it's filled. I actually had a situation where it was filled with milk bottle tops, thousands and thousands of milk bottle tops. And it's like we were trying to figure out like what on earth. And we figured the guy thought it was some form of insulation, basically.
So,
But like very old school. But I like this guy must have drank like 100,000 bottles of milk in order to have that many milk bottle tops. It was the most bizarre find ever. Um, but that's the kind of thing you're talking about. Like you don't know, and then you could take down a piece of plasterboard and find like this huge structural crack running up through the building, and like you can't just put the plasterboard back and ignore
yeah,
it.
you don't know, and there's a lot of vacant buildings around the city, and sometimes you walk past and you think to yourself, why is that sitting there vacant? But when you get into it, and you understand it, and you might do a full survey on the property, and as well as that, there's a lot of fire safety regulation as well.
Yeah, yeah,
Like one of the projects we lent on, um, there was an additional requirement for a full fire safety system in the building, which cost uh, a huge amount of money, a huge amount of money. So a lot of those buildings in the city centre, they're not refurbed because it's too difficult to make them fire compliant.
yeah. I can attest to that because I owned an old period house on the canal, on Herbert Place it was called. And I mean, beautiful old, Georgian house built in the, I think it was built in the 1840s or something like that. And I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to buy this. I'm going to turn it into like a home on the ground, on the basement level, but then I'm going to turn it into offices up above. And so I'm going to have like a pad in the center of town that I can have for myself. And then the offices above, and I thought this sounded like a perfect way to restore the building, make it really beautiful, all that. And then you start getting into the actual fire cert. And the first of
Mm.
all, there was the heritage requirements. Like you
Yeah.
have to get the archaeology on the building done, and that required a report done. And they go into the history of the building and they make sure that there's nothing in it that needs to be listed and all. And after that, then, which is kind of ridiculous, is the fire people come in and they go, oh yeah, all that listed stuff, that doesn't matter a damn. You're going to have to put like a protected corridor here, and you're going to
Yeah.
have to put a landing with a door on it here. And I can remember at the end of it all just thinking, what a complete waste of time. Like I'm not going to do anything with this place. And I'm just going to rent it out as like a pre-63. And so it really does. It can be very difficult to get it to work, like you say.
Yeah, and that's what like the people that may be looking to get into this space need to consider that. Sometimes it may look like a great investment on paper, but you just need to make sure you've considered all the different scenarios and you've assessed it and you've got the right people in to assess the building.
Yeah.
If you have
And
a trust,
ignorance is no defense when you get it wrong in these things. Yeah. Actually, on that point, I wanted to get into the you mentioned you work with valuers.
mm,
That's something that has come up lately through my kind of social media feed. I've had people asking me questions about if you there's a whole sort of work project sort of opportunity out there at the moment, and people are taking a large old house and turning it into a HMO.
yeah,
And so you'll have like a 4 bedroom house or a 5 bedroom house, and you can, legitimately turn it into like a 7 or an 8 bedroom HMO. And if it's done professionally, some of the guys that are on my coaching program, they're very professional the way they approach it. They'll put in 2 kitchens almost, it's like basically double everything. And they'll put in 2 cookers, 2 ovens. They'll put in 2 dishwashers, 2 washing machine, so that there's a
yeah,
duplication of everything. And they'll have every room will be en suite. So it's a very nice environment to kind of live in. And if you've got 8 or 9 people, it doesn't actually feel like it's crowded.
yeah,
But the problem that they have is when they want to get it valued, they might have doubled the income of the property, and they have a very, very good investment that's producing a really, really solid return.
mm,
But when they go to get it valued, along comes a kind of old school valuer and looks at it and goes, "Yeah, that's just a 4 bedroom house." They don't see all the added stuff that you put into it. I'm
yeah. I
curious
think,
how you guys
yeah.
are dealing with that kind of stuff.
We haven't seen any of those investments, to be honest. It sounds interesting. It sounds like a bit like a pre-63. In terms of, I'd like to understand what planning is required to convert kind of a large house into separate units. But if there's planning in place and those units are separated professionally and they're bringing an additional income, that should reflect in the valuation. I'll be surprised if it wasn't reflected.
Yeah, I mean, I know one of the guys that's doing it, he's really refined the process down, like
Yeah,
where every room is separately heated by the central heating and everything. So it's very, very refined. And I think, potentially the house could be pulling in 6 or 7 thousand a month.
yeah,
And so it's earning more than double the value of the house on the market as a family home.
yeah.
But it's obviously not worth twice the value of the house. It's, a
Yeah,
400,000 house doesn't become an 800,000 value house, but it definitely is worth more than the average house on the street, we'll say.
yeah. If it's been carved out into separate units and it's legitimate and there's planning for it, and if the next buyer that comes along can continue to run it as it is, and everything's above board, the valuation should be reflected. I would assume. Now, if it's the case where he squeezed people in when he shouldn't have,
Of course. Yeah, yeah. Well,
or
that's a different story, of course. Yeah. But the reason I'm saying that is that most of the time, what they want to do is they want to get the project done, and then they want to refinance it, and they want to keep it because like
yeah,
that extra income is obviously very valuable to them. And then it's to go and do the next project. So you want to extract, you were mentioning
LTVs, like what kind of loan to value is your limit in working with investors and stuff?
We would typically go up to 70% loan to value. So we would assess the project. So on an acquisition, we'll go up to a max of 70%. But then typically when we're getting valuation for like a new build property or even a refurb, we would get an as is valuation and a completed valuation. So the metrics that we would set and the loan facility we would set would be dictated by a combination of the loan to value and loan to cost. So if we can see that there is going to be enhanced value on completion, then we can lend up to that enhanced value.
Right, I get you.
But there always has to be borrower skin in the game. We'd never get into something if the borrower didn't have significant skin in the game. That's rule number one of lending, essentially.
Yeah.
And so we'd have to go in like the borrower and the lender has to be aligned, and so that means we both have to have appropriate skin in the game, and we both have to be making appropriate returns from the project as well.
And on that, let's talk about the returns. I mean, you're lending and you're borrowing essentially through your platform. So somebody comes along like me and says, okay, I want to build 15 houses. I need to come up with 70% of the site purchase value, presumably. But you need to come up with 70. I'll come up with 30% of it. Is that right?
Yeah, so the maximum we would lend on a site would be 70%. But then we would need to analyze it as a full project. So we could only ever go up to 80% loan to cost over the full project. So we're not going to lend 70 on the site.
And then more on the construction, yeah.
A huge amount of WIP. So the equity, it would have to be a minimum of 20% hard equity in there for the duration of the project.
Yeah, so that would, if you just for the people listening, that would mean that you're taking your site purchase, whatever the purchase of the property is, plus whatever construction that you need, whatever amount you need to cover the construction. The maximum that you're going to lend is 80% of all of that combined.
Of everything, yeah.
Yeah.
So quite often a developer might come to us with an unencumbered site. So they have put all their equity into the site, and we might give 100% of the WIP.
Yeah. Because there's 50-50 really, or whatever. Yeah. I get you. That's interesting. Yeah. It's coming up with all of and then what's the cost? I mean, if I'm borrowing from you, I mean, I know, the ECB is lending out the banks at 4% now, or whatever it is. Like, what is the kind of rate that you expect people to pay? And then what is, if I was putting money into somebody else, what kind of return would I hope to get?
Yeah, so our projects at the moment are offering a 9% per annum return.
9%.
9%. So that's 9% fixed return to investors. So there's no fees deducted from that. We will pay out 9% per annum. In terms of the borrowing rate, it's slightly different because in our space there's arrangement fees, there's interest charged on drawn funds, and then there's exit fees, and then there's also fees for third parties. So valuation, quantity surveyor, solicitor fees will all be paid for by the borrower.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And then on a monthly basis, we would, if there's multiple drawdowns, we would always send in the monitoring surveyor to verify if the money's been spent and to verify the drawdown. So it's slightly different in how the borrower is charged, but it is going to be a derivative of the Euribor rate. So all lenders, like banks and alternative lenders, will charge a set margin over Euribor.
Yeah.
Euribor, as you say, is 3.9, 3.93 at the minute. So there's no getting around it. Rates have increased over the last 18 months for across the board, whether you're lending from a bank or alternative lender. the rate has gone up by about 3.9% across the board.
Yeah. And I mean, if you were to, it's obviously from the person who's listening, who's kind of saying, well, that doesn't answer the question for me. Like, so somebody who's put money into the project is going to get 9% return. Obviously, you've got to make some money on top of that. So would you say, would 11% say when you tot it all up, it's probably going to be in that kind of ballpark, or is it?
Yeah, it's going to be in that ballpark. No,
Yeah.
it depends on the project. It depends on the equity that the borrower is putting in. Depends if there's a social housing exit. But it's going to be in and around that ballpark.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know like the way I look at it is that you go into the banks and they take 6 months to say, oh, sorry, actually, we've decided against it. Whereas 4 to 6 weeks, you can be off and running, subject to paying 11% or thereabouts. The project should make sufficient profit that can actually be tolerated,
Yeah, and we'll typically turn a term sheet around in a week. If we have all the information to hand, we'll turn a term sheet around, and whenever we issue a term sheet, we don't always complete because something might come up in the due diligence process that's different from what's been presented to us. But if we issue a term sheet, there's a very good chance that we're going to complete on the loan. So you don't need to wait 6 weeks. If we give you a term sheet, which we can provide in, let's say, a week, then it's a good chance we're going to complete on it.
So just subject to everything checking out as was presented. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. And from the point of view of how your business has grown since we spoke 3 years ago, like you had only really just set up and you were kind of in the very early stages. Where are you now, like in terms of your market in Ireland and things like that,
Yeah, so we've grown a lot, thankfully. So there's been a lot of headwinds over the last few years. As I said, the last time we spoke was at the start of COVID. We've had the Ukraine war. We've had massive inflation. Now we've had rising interest rates, but thankfully the Irish property market's been extremely robust in the face of all those headwinds. So we've had a very good track record. So we've had one default in 5 years, and with that default, we've recovered 91% of the capital. So we've had about 60 loans and one default.
That's pretty good.
We've now got 7,000 lenders. We've lent over 40 million to Irish home builders. And we're now regulated by the Central Bank of Ireland, and we're looking to grow further. We think it's a win-win for Irish people to be funding Irish homes. The banks are, play a big role in funding larger developments. The government are getting more involved and more active in trying to fund home building, but there's a huge reliance on international capital. And no one's really looking at, well, how can we fund this domestically? Like there's over 150 billion euros sitting in people's deposit accounts.
Yeah.
If we could just incentivize a small proportion of people to invest in local property loans that are offering a good return and are fully secured against the property, we think is a win-win. Because a lot of those foreign investors, which we need, and we need to encourage those foreign investors to invest in Ireland, but that capital is very mobile.
Yeah.
If they decide that they're getting better returns in another market, or there's political instability, or the Irish economy takes a hit, that can leave. Also, the returns from the international capital is often repatriated back to the original country, whereas if we can incentivize domestic investors in Irish projects, well, all that that money is going to be reinvested back into the local economy. So we think it's a win-win. We're effectively just trying to match local investors with local home builders, and that's it in a nutshell, really.
That's brilliant. And in terms of growing your market, like once again, who are you looking to hear from? Local house builders, good reputation.
Yeah, local home builders, SME home builders that are looking to borrow anything up to 10 million.
That sounds...
in all parts of the country, good track record. They have to provide their own, a portion of their own equity. But that's it. And on the investor side, I kind of built the business with, it is an online business, like first and foremost. So we built it with really good functionality, like a fancy dashboard. I was kind of building it for someone like myself. I'm 40 now. But what we find is most of our investors are typically a bit older. So typically people in their 50s, 60s that want a solid return. Like we're not getting kind of the 20-year-old, 30-year-old looking, for massive returns. We're really looking for, most of our investors are risk averse and they like investing in us because we have security behind it.
Yeah.
So anytime we lend, we take first charge security over the property. And I think that's what people like, and people like the fact that it's a good return for the level of risk that you're taking.
Sounds good, David. I'm just watching the clock there. I'm thinking that somebody might want to reach out and learn more about Property Bridges and maybe kind of get a bit of a flavor for how they could take a deal forward. You and I are going to do a workshop on Saturday, the 3rd of February. And so anyone who's listening who's interested in that, I'll put a link down in the show notes below. But besides that workshop that we're going to run, how would people reach out and find more about this?
So you can log on to our website, www.propertybridges.com, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. But all the information is on the website. You can sign up in a matter of minutes, or you can just go onto the homepage. You can look at what we do on the homepage. You can read about our stats, read all about us. And yeah, that's it.
Brilliant. All right, David, best of luck with everything, and look forward to seeing you on the 3rd of February.
Great. Thanks, Gavin.
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with David Jelly. I've rushed this one out primarily because the 3rd of February is very close, and I didn't want to leave it any longer for people to get an opportunity to book the date into their diary, and to, if you are interested, go and click the link below and book your place for that event. I expect they will sell out quite quickly, given the fact there's only going to be 20 of them. And so if you are going to be there, you'll get to meet all of the members of the mastermind who are coming along. They obviously can attend for free. And we do 3 of these events a year. And apart from that, we do the weekly call that I have with my coaching clients and my mastermind clients. So guys, I hope you're going to find this one useful. I hope you find the event worthy, and that one that you'd like to come along. And I'd like to meet some of you guys if you're listening in and you're interested in doing that. So until further ado, I shall speak to you next week. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Behind the Facade. If you have any questions or topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes, please connect with me via the Facebook group that is called Behind the Facade Community. Alternatively, you will find me on social media. My handle is Gavin J. Gallagher. You can stay up to date with all of my content and the various projects I'm working on over on my website, gavinjgallagher.com. And while you're there, please do add your name to the Join My Tribe thing over on the right-hand side. This will ensure you're kept up to date via my weekly newsletter. All of these links are in the show notes below. That's all for now. I will see you guys in the next episode.